Good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening speaker In Garson, who is professor at Hunter College and at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He is an expert in many areas of the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of psychiatry, and the author of two recent books, Madness, a Philosophical Exploration, and The Biological Mind, a Philosophical Introduction. And watch out for his third book when that comes out, which is called The Madness Pill, The Quest to Create Insanity, and One Doctor's Discovery that Transformed Psychiatry. This evening, his talk will be on Beyond Psychiatry, Rethinking Madness Outside Medicine. Justin.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here, particularly on a rough evening. I want to thank the Royal Institute of Philosophy for inviting me, and get this going, and particularly its academic director, Edward Harcourt. So thank you so much for having me. So today I want to talk about what I see as a paradigm shift that's taking place in the way that we think and the way that we talk about mental illness. And it's a shift from what I call dysfunction framings of mental illness to function framings of mental illness. But you can also describe it as a shift from a pathology to a purpose framing. You could describe it as a shift from a disease to a design point of view. So I'll first just spend some time using some examples to illustrate what I mean by a function and a dysfunction point of view on mental illness. And then I'll talk about some of the broader implications of this shift for research, for treatment, and for stigma, but also what it means for people who have been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses. So I'll start by saying something about what motivated me to get interested in this topic of psychiatry. I have a lot of mental illness in my family, as I'm sure some of you do as well. In the 1970s, my dad was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He was working under the American President Richard Nixon at the time, and Nixon actually loved to bug his staff and surveil them, and I don't know if that had something to do with it or not. But about 10 years later, in the 1980s, he was re-diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and he would often hear voices. He would think that God was talking to him, or that the French actress Catherine Deneuve was kind of speaking to him telepathically. But it was such a normal part of my upbringing, I started to think that this was pretty normal, that hearing voices could just be one kind of cognitive style, like being introverted or extroverted. I thought, maybe we shouldn't be too quick to call it a disease or a dysfunction, rather than just a different way of processing information about the world. And I'm sure, as some of you know, there's an organization called Hearing Voices Network that helps people to manage their voices and even to live well with their voices. Some of the people who go through the Hearing Voices Network say that they feel that their voices give them a sense of insight or creativity or comfort. And so early on, I started to suspect that this whole medical approach to thinking about voice hearing as a kind of symptom of a brain defect might really be doing a disservice to people, maybe even making their experiences far worse. And then when I was 16, I was hospitalized for depression. I was in an adolescent psychiatric ward for about 6 weeks. And this was right at the time when Prozac hit the market. And so I was very quickly led to understand that my depression was the byproduct of some kind of a chemical imbalance in my brain having to do with the neurotransmitter serotonin, and that drugs like Prozac worked by reversing that chemical imbalance. And I suppose that framework probably did some good for me, though it also had some negative impacts for sure, because I always grew up with this idea that there was something wrong with the way that my brain worked, and maybe I needed somebody to kind of come along and fix it for me. But during the time in the psych ward, I met a lot of kids, young people people, teenagers, they had a lot of different problems. But when they told me about their home lives, then some of the problems that they talked about, like addiction or conduct disorder or depression or borderline personality disorder or self-harm, it was easier for me to see this not in terms of something going wrong with their brains, but in terms of they were doing the best that they could, adjusting to a pretty volatile home situation. And that reinforced this idea, well, what if a lot of this disorder, language, disease, dysfunction is really just doing a disservice to people by making people think that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way that their brains or the way that their minds work. So I didn't think much about those issues until many years later. I was a graduate student in philosophy, and I came across this little book. It's written by a psychiatrist and an evolutionary biologist. It's called Why We Get Sick. And the basic idea behind the book is that we'll never really understand health and disease until we look at it in terms of the big picture of the evolution of life on Earth. But, they claim, when we do take that evolutionary perspective, then some of the things that we've seen as diseases, we'll actually see them as designed responses of the human body and the human mind to various kinds of pressures. And a wonderful example of this is fever. So until about the 1700s, most doctors thought that fever was a serious disease. They thought that when a patient gets very hot, it must be because something has gone terribly wrong, and it's like the heat itself represents something that's broken down. And so the point of the doctors would be to try to reduce the patient's heat by drugs, by bleeding, by vomiting. And then around 1700, there was a brilliant German scientist who said, wait a minute, what if, hear me out, what if the fever is actually a designed response of the body for dealing with some kind of disease? What if the fever is actually the good thing that's trying to help you fight the disease? Now, today we know that he's right. We're not sure exactly why, but fever does seem to help the immune system fight off infections. But that idea, even 300 years ago, really changed everything about the way that we deal with fever, because instead of seeing it as a disease that you're trying to attack, you see it as your body's healing process that you're trying to work with in order to fight the deeper problem. Doesn't mean you shouldn't use drugs for fever. Doesn't mean you should never take Advil for fever, but it means the whole point of the drugs is to help curb its excessive manifestations and allow the fever to kind of run its course. So in this book, Why We Get Sick, there's a wonderful chapter. I think it's chapter 10, and it's called Are Mental Disorders Diseases? And the conclusion they draw is no, not all mental disorders are diseases. Some of them are actually designed responses of the human mind to life problems. And one of the examples that they use is depression, and I'll talk about this because this really spoke to my own history of depression. So we often think, even today, of depression as something like a chemical imbalance or a serotonin imbalance in the brain that you can reverse using drugs like Prozac. But instead, they argue, many cases of depression are plausibly part of your mind's designed mechanism for dealing with a certain kind of situation. And the basic idea that they present is that depression is your brain's way of telling you that something in your life isn't working out and needs more attention. Could be a job, could be a career path, could be a relationship. Depression is like your mind's functional signal to pay more attention to something in your life. It's not pathological, it's purposeful. It's not diseased, it's designed. And at the time I read that, I thought, this book is so subversive. It's like throwing a hand grenade into the psychiatric establishment. Because think about what it would mean if they were right. It would mean that if somebody's depressed, the best path forward isn't necessarily to bombard their brains with medication. It's not even necessarily to tell them that their perspective on life is warped and that it should change. It's really about listening to what the depression is trying to say. It's about saying, look, your depression is a sign of a perfectly healthy brain trying to deal with pretty normal or perhaps pretty unusual experiences. So let's find out what your depression is trying to tell you. Again, like fever, that doesn't mean pills have no role at all, but it means part of the point of the pills would be to help perhaps manage your emotions until you could get into a situation where you could really find out what the depression is trying to tell you. And so I got very fascinated with this idea, and I started wondering, I wonder if anybody else in the whole history of psychiatry has ever had an idea like this. I wonder if anybody else in the history of the world has ever had this idea that some of the things that we call mental disorders are functional rather than dysfunctional, or designed rather than diseased. And the first person who came to mind was Freud. Freud had a lot of ideas that were probably wrong. I'm not trying to endorse anything he said, but he certainly had the view that often enough, when somebody has what we call mental illness, it's actually performing some kind of a deep purpose or function. And he thought part of the goal of therapy is to figure out what purpose this illness is trying to serve and to help the patient to heal by knowing what that purpose is. And sometimes he actually got very angry with his medical colleagues who couldn't see in anything like delusions or voice hearing, who weren't able to see the working out of a purpose or goal or function. And so I kept going back through psychiatry's history. Another thinker I found was Philippe Pinel. Pinel was very famous in the history of psychiatry. He's often described as having broken off the chains of the mad patients at the Basset mental asylum in Paris. And it's true that he ushered in very humanitarian reforms in the mental asylums. But one of the things that a lot of historians don't know about him is that he had some pretty radical ideas. He actually thought that some of what we call psychotic episodes are like fever. He speculated that they had a kind of healing and cathartic quality. And so in his view, as a rule, you really didn't want to interfere with these psychotic episodes. You wanted to let them run their course in a safe environment. At the same time, there was a German doctor, Johann Christian August Heinroth, one of the first people to use the term psychiatry in a book. And he wrote this 800-page treatise on psychiatry, and most of it reads like a fairly standard medical treatise. But about halfway through the book, he starts describing this one particular disorder that the English translation translates as insanity with dementia and rage. And what he says is here's what happens in this condition. The tragedies of life become overwhelming. And when that happens, nature, as it were, strives to kind of buffer the patient's mind from this kind of pain. Nature, as it were, places the person in this kind of dream world of hallucinations and delusions. And Heinroth agreed with Pinel that in the best of cases, you don't really want to intervene in something like that. He thought you want to allow this nature to run its course. And what's important is that he never suggests or insinuates here that maybe the patient just isn't strong enough to deal with what life throws at them. He never suggests that the patient has a weak character or anything like that. he says that nature itself somehow brings about this detachment for the sake of the patient. The same way with fever. When somebody has a fever, you don't say, boy, you know, if you were really a stronger person, you'd be able to fight off this infection all by yourself without the fever. It really had nothing to do with blame or responsibility. And then my explorations led me finally back to a wonderful, very strange, one of the strangest books that I've ever read, The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, the first edition, I think 1621. He was a scholar, a philosopher, a theologian, and he wrote a lot about melancholy, which was the kind of like the precursor to depression. Now, Burton was steeped in a very religious worldview, like many of his contemporaries. They thought a lot about why would God allow madness? Why would God allow melancholy to happen? And one part of his response is that madness and melancholy, this is like God's wake-up call. God is trying to get the person to realize that there's something in their life that's not going well and to make some kind of a serious life change. So he kind of comes back around to the evolutionary psychiatrist. Now, is there a moral dimension to Pinnell's thought? Absolutely. Was he suggesting that madness and melancholy were somehow God's punishment for vice and sin and wickedness? Yes, he was absolutely saying that. He was saying that it's partly because of our sinful ways that God had to release madness and melancholy into the world to punish us and hopefully redeem us. And so I think it's very natural when people read Burton today, they say, you know, what a terrible viewpoint, what an awful, stigmatizing viewpoint that, you know, depression is due to some kind of a sin or a character flaw. Absolutely, it is an awful, stigmatizing viewpoint to hold, but I think it's important to recognize that in his work, there's a seed of a very important, really powerful insight that depression and other mental health problems could in some sense be by design. They could have a purpose or a function, even if it's not God trying to punish you for something bad that you did. And so in that respect, I do think that there's something very modern in his thinking. So all that to say, I started thinking that a lot of the historians of psychiatry had really gotten things wrong. They didn't so much get things wrong, but I think they had a rather narrow point of view. So here's what a lot of historians do when they think about the history of psychiatry. They describe the history of psychiatry as little more than a kind of pendulum swinging back and forth between biological, brain-based points of view and psychological, mind-based points of view. So here's the kind of thing that historians will say. They'll say, you know, in the 1800, you had Felipe Pinel. He had a very psychological, mind-based point of view. And then by the 1850s, 1860s, you had this era of German imperial psychiatry, very biological, brain-based point of view. And then in 1900, you have Freud. It goes back to this psychological, mind-based point of view. And then, of course, in the 1970s, 1980s, the resurgence of this second biological revolution with the chemical imbalances and the antidepressants and such. And I think that there is some truth to that way of reading psychiatry, but I also think it's very limited. And I started seeing psychiatry's history, really the history of madness, in terms of something like a clash or a confrontation between these two main perspectives, one which I call madness as dysfunction, and the other which I call madness as strategy. And the basic idea of madness as dysfunction is very simple. When somebody's mad, when somebody has a serious, what we would call today, a serious mental illness, something inside of them isn't working the way that it's supposed to. Something inside of it is not working as it should or as nature intended. They're distressing or disturbing or extreme, experiences or thoughts or feelings or actions, or something like the byproduct of a broken mechanism. And from this point of view, the doctor's job, at least conceptually speaking, is very simple. The doctor needs to figure out exactly what went wrong and to fix it, maybe using drugs, maybe using therapy. In contrast, in what I'm calling madness as strategy, the basic idea is that often enough in what we call madness or mental illness, everything inside the person is working pretty much exactly the way that it's supposed to. Everything inside the person is working exactly the way that it should, and the doctor's job or the healer's job is to figure out what that purpose or function or goal is, and then use that knowledge to help to guide healing. So that's why I say that I think instead of talking about madness as strategy versus madness as dysfunction, you could talk about pathology and purpose framings, or you could talk about disease versus design framings. So I think there are really two reasons why this way of framing psychiatry's history in terms of function and dysfunction points of view is really important for us today. It's important not only for psychiatrists and psychologists and other mental health professionals, but also for people who have been diagnosed with serious mental illnesses, whether with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or borderline personality disorder or depression or anxiety. And I think there are two ways that thinking about things in terms of function and dysfunction can be very helpful. First, I think it gives us a kind of language or framework for talking about some of the most interesting and exciting and kind of cutting-edge research projects out there. So I've been fortunate enough to write regularly on some of this research for Psychology Today. I've had an opportunity to meet with a lot of the scientists and researchers and theorists who are really exploring these points of view and who are working in this tradition of what I call madness as a strategy. And I should say that they're always quite pleased to be told that they represent the cutting edge of a kind of intellectual tradition that goes back for thousands of years and that forms a coherent, viable alternative to this disease or dysfunction point of view. I think it can be very empowering for some of these scientists and researchers and theorists to feel like, okay, I am part of a intellectual tradition that goes back for a very long time. So I just want to describe very quickly 4 different projects just to give you a sense of the ongoing relevance of what I'm calling madness as strategy. The first I've already mentioned, go through quickly, has to do with depression. Again, in the in the 80s, it was very common to see depression as the byproduct of a chemical imbalance. My own view is that the theory that supported that, the serotonin hypothesis, has been pretty much refuted. I mean, I don't know if it's been entirely refuted, but I know that the evidence was always far weaker than a lot of us had been led to think at the time. And instead, as I've mentioned, some of the psychiatrists like Randolph Nesse and others have been promoting this very different point of view, which suggests that depression, far from being a brain dysfunction, is actually in many cases your brain's designed mechanism to show you that something in your life isn't going well, it needs to change. And at least some psychiatrists and therapists have reported that they've used this paradigm to great effect with their patients. And they think that it should be more part of our common language and common understanding around depression. A second example comes from the whole realm of what are sometimes called personality disorders, particularly what's called borderline personality disorder, or BPD. This is a very contested category, but BPD effectively describes a cluster of traits associated with deep mistrust of other people, volatile interpersonal relationships, impulsiveness, self-harm. Up until recently, a lot of theorists thought of BPD perhaps as the result of some kind of a frontal lobe deficit or some kind of an executive dysfunction that makes you impulsive. But an emerging point of view that's becoming more mainstream is that some of the traits that we associate with borderline personality disorder, like mistrust, are actually survival strategies. They're not brain defects. So there's evidence that up to 80% of people who have received a diagnosis of BPD have a history of trauma, abuse, or neglect. And from that point of view, it becomes far more plausible to think, okay, what if mistrusting other people is a perfectly coherent strategy for given what they've been through? And if that's right, I think two things follow. First, I think we should throw out the whole disorder, disease, dysfunction language. I don't think that's helping anybody. I think it's just stigmatizing and disempowering. But more importantly, for research, instead of looking for some kind of hypothetical brain dysfunction, the better approach might be, okay, how are these strategies, which might have come in very useful for you in the past, how might these strategies be hindering you today? And what are some alternative strategies that might make you have a better, fuller, richer life? A third example comes from the study of delusions. Delusions being effectively bizarre beliefs that have no social or very little social sanction, that I'm the second coming of Christ, that God is giving me a special mission, that a famous actress is in love with me and speaking with me telepathically. Surely, you might think delusions have to be some kind of a serious brain dysfunction. But there's another point of view that says that some delusions might actually have a protective function. Maybe like Heinroth said 200 years ago, some of them are kind of designed to buffer the mind from a truth that's too difficult to bear. In particular, there's a lot of research on what are called motivated delusions. So one example here is that's often used is called reverse Othello syndrome. And reverse Othello syndrome is when somebody has the delusional belief that their spouse is not cheating on them, when all of the evidence makes it abundantly clear that their spouse is, in fact, cheating on them. And I think many theorists can look at this and say, okay, I suspect that this delusion is probably protecting your mind in some way. That's not a stretch to think of this delusion as having some kind of a function, goal, or purpose. But if that's right, it really changes everything. Since what it means, kind of like depression, that the point of therapy isn't necessarily to, bombard your brain with antipsychotic drugs. The point would be to figure out what these delusions are trying to do, and then to work with the person to perhaps adopt some better strategy for achieving similar ends. Finally, I want to mention dyslexia. I mean, we don't think of this as a form of madness, though it is in the DSM as a mental disorder. But I think similar points can probably be made about ADHD and perhaps some forms of autism. Dyslexia is often described simply as a disorder of reading or writing. So the basic idea is that in the dyslexic person, certain brain pathways that were supposed to have developed just never developed. But there's actually really interesting evidence drawn from a variety of sources that dyslexia might actually be an evolved cognitive style, a kind of unique way of processing information and navigating the world. So, for example, there's evidence that people with dyslexia are actually better at what we might call big picture thinking. There's evidence that people with dyslexia are quite literally quicker to notice when something represents an impossible figure. They're quicker to say, well, wait a minute, that figure is impossible. They also tend to excel at what's called divergent thinking, which is the ability to come up with multiple solutions to the same problem. So there's some evidence that up to a third of American entrepreneurs have dyslexia, which would make sense in terms of their ability to kind of solve problems on the go. So all this evidence is pointing to the conclusion that dyslexia is not a dysfunction, it is a distinctive cognitive style. And I want to take a moment to just reflect on the moral implications of this for dyslexia or ADHD or some forms of autism. Because then the question is, okay, well then what are we doing when we take a 12-year-old kid? What are we doing when we describe their dyslexia to them as some kind of a brain dysfunction? Sorry, the parts of your brain that were supposed to develop just never developed, and you're always going to struggle with reading and writing, and you're always going to need some additional remedial support to kind of get up to speed with your peers, maybe summer school, maybe other strategies, rather than saying, it looks like you have a distinctive cognitive style with its own strengths, perhaps its own shortcomings, and let's think about what are some life paths that would really allow you and people with your distinctive cognitive styles to really flourish. And this leads me to the final big point, which also has to do with these moral and ethical issues. And let me preface what I want to say about this in the following way. In the 1970s and the 1980s, a lot of psychiatrists, mental health, and other mental health professionals had this idea that dysfunction, disorder, or disease framings of mental illness would be really useful to suffering patients. They would be good for people because they would help alleviate stigma. So the idea was this. Suppose I think of my schizophrenia as a brain disease, kind of like cancer, or I think of depression as a disease, kind of like diabetes. I'd realize I wasn't to blame for these for my condition any more with somebody than somebody would say breast cancer is to blame for their cancer. And that knowledge, the idea went, would alleviate all of the much of the terrible stigma associated with mental illness. That was the idea. It was a very noble idea. Unfortunately, I think about a decade's worth of research has demonstrated rather conclusively that dysfunction framings of mental health problems tend to introduce and reinforce new kinds of stigma, stigma that in some cases are more harmful than the stigma that they were meant to alleviate. So I think there's a lot of evidence that these dysfunction-centered framings tend to be accompanied by three distinctive kinds of problems. First, they tend to increase stigma as measured by the desire for social distance. So if I think that your depression or your schizophrenia is the result of some kind of a brain disorder, I'm more inclined to think of you as somebody that's unpredictable and somebody that I might want to keep my distance from. Over the last 30 years, interestingly enough, sadly, stigma toward mental illness has actually been increasing rather than decreasing, which is what you would expect given the prevalence of biomedical framings. Second, these framings tend to increase pessimism about treatment outcomes. So if I think that my depression is the byproduct of a chemical imbalance in my brain, I tend to think of it as a permanent or persistent feature of how my brain works, rather than a rather transient, episode. Third, disease framings of mental illness tend to bias people in the direction of thinking that pills are an optimal solution. So a lot of work has been done showing that people who believe in chemical imbalance framings of depression also tend to believe that pills are an optimal source of treatment rather than therapy. So it leads to this kind of tunnel vision about treatment outcomes. Okay, so all of this has led to the following conclusion that I want to leave you with. First, I do think that our casual use of these disease framings, dysfunction, disorder framings of mental health problems is not only scientifically suspect, but I think it's morally problematic. I think it's morally dubious. So more and more, when I see psychiatrists, many of them with the best of intentions, when I see psychiatrists and other mental health professionals promoting these kind of disease, dysfunction, disorder framings, I'm inclined to think, look, not only are you failing to provide suffering people with different alternative framings of what they're going through, but you might actually be doing something that's morally pernicious. Not that you're aware of that, but you might actually be morally doing something morally wrong. And what I suspect is that as the evidence of the harms associated with biomedical framings becomes more available, as more people become aware of the evidence, I do think that more people will begin to see it as morally disseminating these kinds of frameworks as morally problematic. And there's one final thought I want to leave you with. You might think, well, what are you saying, Justin? Are you saying that nobody's mental health problems come from a brain dysfunction? Are you saying that, the confusion or anxiety associated with dementia doesn't come from a brain dysfunction? That's not what I'm saying at all. Are you saying, maybe everybody's mental health problems has some deep purpose and we got to, psychoanalyze them until that deep purpose comes up? That's not what I'm saying at all. And I suppose if I wanted to put it in a somewhat simple and concise way, simple and concise as far as philosophers are concerned, I would say something like, I guess that's not too simple and concise. I would say something like this. People who have distressing, disturbing, or what I would call extreme psychological experiences have a right to be exposed to multiple and scientifically credible frameworks for making sense of those experiences. So, for example, if somebody ultimately does come to accept a dysfunction-centered framework for making sense of their mental health problems, I want it to be because they had some familiarity with a range of alternative and scientifically based frameworks, and they chose to accept that framework as the optimal one for making sense of their experiences. And thank you very much. I really appreciate you being here.
Sure. I haven't quite formulated this perhaps, but yeah, that's a brilliant talk, and I think I'm pretty much on the same page as you. I think the idea of like a disease model for some people though may provide like a sense-making purpose, and so whilst it might not be scientifically as valid as we might have been led to believe down the path, I think the main challenge for these alternative framings is providing that same kind of sense-making mechanism. So I think of like a strategy framing like has scope, but maybe like would a coping strategy framing be slightly more appealing for like, yeah, kind of sense-making goal of what's going on in people's lives, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. And that's how I more and more tend to think about dysfunction-centered framings. It's like, okay, we have all of these different sense-making framings. We have all these different narratives to help people make sense of what they're experiencing, what's distressing to them or perhaps disturbing to other people. And for some people, dysfunction-centered framings are extremely useful. I've heard that for people who struggle with panic disorder. Sometimes it's very helpful to say, okay, part of my brain is just misfiring right now, and I'm just gonna let this run its course. But I do, my fear is that we've allowed these kinds of dysfunction framings to just have such a grip on our collective discourse that it's sometimes hard to even see alternatives. And I do think that we do need to take a kind of case-by-case perspective. So I've looked at these 4 different kinds of issues, depression or delusions or so-called personality disorders, and I think each one might have its own somewhat distinctive strategy-type narrative associated with it. But yeah, to me, about legitimate kind of multiplicity of views.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. It's very relevant to me because about 15 years ago, I was given 3 diagnoses, and I wasn't quite sure how to interpret them. I never thought that I had a disease, for instance, and I equally don't feel I have a disorder either. One of those diagnoses is BPD, or I tend to prefer the European term, emotionally unstable. But it kind of felt like it was a diagnosis of the month at one point. You know, we don't know what to do with this person. Let's give him this. And I think it's really important to recognize that my journey, if you like, since those diagnoses has taken on my own understanding of what goes on for me, and they certainly are around trauma, for instance, and my ability to, if you like, react appropriately rather than inappropriately, because clearly a lot of things that happened in my childhood that I wouldn't have understood as being traumatic, today I do. And I guess what keeps happening, and for me, in many respects, is that I'm very often hypervigilant to that potential danger that's going on, even though it doesn't necessarily present itself. But equally, you know, if you've got that kind of built-in mistrust of people and that kind of feeling that something bad is always going to happen, then in a way it is a survival strategy, and it served a purpose. It may not serve a purpose today, if you like, and I guess that's the struggle, isn't it? Is to change that way of behaving today that may have been appropriate back then, but clearly isn't now. And I do think there's a real stubbornness within, you know, the medical model, really. I mean, you know, this reliance on the DSM and the ICD, you know, is kind of almost too rigid, I think, in a way. And it would be really great, instead of having this division between physical and mental health, why don't we just have health or well-being? Because realistically, that stigma, as soon as you put anything into the mental health box, it comes with a whole host of baggage. And I even stigmatize myself. And yet I've got nothing to be, if you like, ashamed of or blameless in many respects.
That's a great question that you've just formulated. Why don't we just have health rather than mental health versus physical health? Should we let Justin respond to that?
Can I just finish this off?
Actually, make it quick if you wouldn't mind.
Yes, I appreciate that. So I suppose what's really important for me is about thinking of alternatives. So for me, the power, threat, meaning framework has made a lot of sense in my own life, and it kind of brings a lot of relevance to that experience and how I try and think about things today rather than from that medical basis, if you like. But yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I've talked to there's so much to respond to, but I've talked to several people who've been diagnosed with BPD and feel that in some ways it was kind of a life sentence, and maybe it helped clarify some things for them, but a lot of folks feel like it was just almost like a condemnation in a way. And I do think this idea, I like Lucy Johnstone's work and the framework, and I do think that even seeing the problems I'm going through as survival strategies, okay, they might have outlived their usefulness in some ways, but they are strategies that I had to adopt to deal with a certain kind of situation. And I think that for a lot of folks, that's a much more intuitive and natural and empowering way of thinking about what's going on, rather than my brain just doesn't work right.
Thank you for this talk. It was very, very interesting. And like someone said earlier, I really align with most of the things you said, I think. And I guess I'm curious about whether you have, because you've presented beautifully those purposes for different situations of the mind, and whether you have also some ideas about autism and ADHD that you might be able to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I've written a bit about ADHD for the Psychology Today blog, and I do, if you go to my website, you can see the information about the blog, and that I just like using it to write about some of these madness-as-strategy frameworks. But yeah, I think ADHD is fascinating. My son was diagnosed with ADHD, and so we've been kind of trying to think about, okay, how to provide the kind of academic accommodations that he needs, and at the same time, how to think about this outside of the disorder or dysfunction framework. And I do think that there are some very intriguing lines of evidence suggesting that ADHD too is a kind of evolved cognitive style, and then certain kinds of communities, particularly nomadic communities, people with ADHD-like traits tend to thrive and do pretty well for themselves and take on a kind of leadership role because of their shifting attention, the novelty seeking, the desire to find new kinds of lands and new resources. So I think that there was a role for it, and that there still is a role for it. But restructuring the way that we think about ADHD outside of the dysfunction disorder toward, okay, this is an exploratory cognitive style, so let's figure out how to arrange our educational systems to kind of satisfy and to cultivate this exploratory, the way that your mind works. It's extremely important, I think. I don't know if my son cares that much. He says, okay, Dad, that's fine, that's fine, whatever.
First, thank you for this rich presentation. I did want to ask, as you mentioned, the kind of neurotransmitter dysfunction viewpoint is the leading viewpoint. In your opinion, what do you think is needed to increase kind of awareness or trust in the other viewpoints?
I mean, I think in my point of view, one reason that when people say, look, the serotonin theory of depression is not true, there's really not evidence for it, or the evidence is far less than we once thought, I think it's hard for people to know what to do with that without being given some kind of alternative framework for making sense of these experiences. So you can beat up on the chemical imbalance hypotheses as much as you want, but until you have some alternative framework that says, okay, well then what does it mean when somebody can't get out of bed and they don't want to wash or go to work and they don't want to connect with any of their friends? How do you think about this? So I think for me, I feel that part of my role is just to help promote these alternative framings, and particularly the design point of view. But I do think people need an alternative framing before they can leave behind some of these chemical imbalance theories.
So yeah, just my question was, with the purpose-based sort of function-based framing, are there any implications for the justice system?
That's a great question. I'm not sure how to answer that. It's a good question. I wish I had a great answer for you. It's complicated because, right now in the justice system, if somebody says, okay, you acted this particular way because you have a brain dysfunction. Something's gone wrong with your brain. We can look at it in an fMRI. We can see that your brain is defective in some particular way. That can be really helpful and beneficial because it makes sure often that people aren't punished excessively for something that they do have some lessened responsibility for. So it's certainly true that as we move away from dysfunction-centered framings, I do think we need to come up with alternative narratives to help provide to help provide some of those kinds of benefits. Do you know what I mean? So if I say, I'm just thinking out loud here, but if we say, okay, you don't, like take something like BPD, where you say, okay, we don't think that you have a brain disorder, but we do think that you've adopted a set of survival strategies that might be maladaptive in your current environment, and that might partly explain why you did these kinds of things that you're getting punished for. Perhaps that knowledge alone can help alleviate some of the blame, but it's a good question.
Hello there, Justin. Thank you for the presentation. A couple of things. I was wondering, with the madness as strategy, you mentioned that everything inside them is working as it's supposed to. Is that purely from a biological point of view?
I mean that on multiple levels. So initially, I did mean that from a purely biological point of view. So I'd encountered the evolutionary psychiatrists, and when they talk about function, everything functioning the way it's supposed to, what they mean is from an evolutionary point of view. The parts of your brain are literally designed, if you will, by natural selection to become depressed in certain kinds of situations. But then as I started going back through Freud and through Pinel and through Burton, I started to see that all of them were talking about the same kind of thing. All of them seemed to share this idea that in what we call madness or mental illness, things are working the way that they're supposed to, but they all had very different understandings of what exactly it means for things to be working the way that they should. So that's why, even though I started with a more evolutionary biological way of thinking about function, I had to broaden out to think about function in somewhat more general and intuitive terms.
And I was also quickly wondering about, in this new method of framing, whether, since madness is kind of a broad definition, whether it kind of took on two different lives, that being trauma-based and also other conditions like you mentioned, dyslexia. Did you find that your research was branching off into two different directions, or does the framing work for all conditions the same way?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways in which we might say something is functional or a strategy in some way. And one might be dyslexia as an evolved cognitive strategy. It's not a response to trauma, nothing. It's just that people's brains function somewhat differently, and for good reasons. These different kinds of cognitive styles might have emerged thousands of years ago when we had a very different kind of environment, where for other people the idea of strategy means something like a trauma response, a survival strategy that I had to acquire as a result of certain kinds of things that happened to me. And then in other cases still, like these theories about delusions, the idea of strategy might be, it's not so much a trauma response and it's not so much an evolved cognitive style, but it's just an immediate, there is some psychological benefit to be gained by effectively blocking off the knowledge that, say, my spouse is cheating on me. So yeah, I do think it ramifies into at least 3, maybe 4 different specific forms.
Thanks, Justin. And as a psychotherapist, this madness as strategy approach is how I work. And I think what's interesting to me is when I run into biological psychiatry, it's a kind of, a bit like you said, the biological, psychological. It's kind of, we just can't talk the same language. And I love this framing, but I wonder if, again, it runs into the same difficulty of traction. And it's interesting that you frame it as a sort of moral problem, because I suppose what I see when these debates come up is what's unspoken in the room is shame. Because if you have been following a particular track, madness as dysfunction, and suddenly something opens up as, oh, hang on, is it madness as strategy? What does that mean for my 20-year career as a biological psychiatrist? And I think that, for me, that shame, I've seen it in rooms, not particularly spoken, but it's there, where there's a sort of opening, and then there's a kind of, okay, I'm going to shut back down because I can't another kind of protective mechanism of delusion, potentially. I can't open up to that. So I'm just interested in that question. And then the other reflection I had, which was what you shared about stigma, I think that's super interesting, because there was, I don't know if you know about it, there was a very supposedly successful anti-stigma campaign in the UK that ran for 20 years. I worked for one of the organizations that was behind it, called Time for Change. And I think what's interesting is that on the measures that they had, it had been very successful. Stigma had changed. But what stigma about what? Stigma had changed, like we no longer blame people for their mental illnesses. But I think that's very interesting what you're sharing about where stigma perhaps increased on different measures that were just not being measured. And therefore the campaign's successful, but actually it's not. So that's super interesting to see that.
Yeah, thank you for those. And just real quickly, on the first, I've talked with enough psychiatrists and mental health theorists about this, and I've seen different reactions from, oh, this is a really interesting, useful framework. I appreciate your dividing up the history of psychiatry in this particular way. It helps me to have a broader view of what I'm doing with some of my patients. But sometimes I do, absolutely, not to psychoanalyze psychiatrists too much, but I do see a kind of, okay, this is interesting, Justin, but at the end of the day, these dysfunction, people do have very serious dysfunctions. And what the motives are for that, I can't entirely say. But I think you're absolutely right, too, about the stigma, where from my reading, a lot of the biomedical framings do, in fact, help to alleviate stigma in the sense of blame. People do feel less blameworthy. But I think what's happened is exactly right. We haven't been tracking these other particular forms of stigma, such as the desire for social distance. I want to move myself away from somebody who has a brain dysfunction, and the kind of pessimism about treatment outcomes. So we're just learning how to really measure and track these.
Hi there. Thank you for your contributions, and this lecture is great. I was really touched by what you were saying with regards to the stigmatization of certain things. As a person who's diverse, I was diagnosed with dyslexia in primary school, but wasn't diagnosed with ADHD and autism until my adult years, which I found out was because a lot of women were considered not, applicable to certain studies. But my entire experience going through the health services with various different types of, I would say, misdiagnoses, different things, made me not trust, honestly, the ideas that are being put forward about mental health that was primarily from professionals. I was getting all these different experiences, and I was speaking to people that were also diverse, and they had those same experiences, and it made me think, I need to start educating myself, hence why I'm here, on what's going on and what different people from outside of the circles that I'm necessarily interacting with think. And I want to know what you feel is the most productive way for us as a modern free society to move past these ideas, because I understand that I don't think it's necessarily a biological issue. I think it's a societal issue, and I think it benefits certain groups of people to have certain other groups of people in boxes, and I felt like that. And so some of my experiences have been due to, I don't know, cultural upbringing, whatever, but the overwhelming feeling is that this is a societal thing. So I would like to know what you think is the most progressive way to kind of combat that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. I'm not sure how to. There's so many aspects to thinking about that. I mean, one, as you said, I think that there's a lot of people who are trained in medicine who, when they get that training, they also acquire these dysfunction-centered perspectives. And so I hate to be that person who sounds conspiratorial, say, look, the doctors just don't know. Particularly in the United States, when we have a serious problem with conspiracy theories and people not trusting scientists and doctors. But I do think in this case, there is something to be said for the idea that medical training itself can kind of blinker your understanding of certain conditions. So that's where I feel that certainly the best that I can do is simply try to promote these alternatives and get them directly. I used to want to try to sway psychiatrists or other mental health professionals, and I hope some of this does, but I think that for me it's more important to just bring these ideas directly and help to promote these ideas for the people who are struggling with these particular labels. But I do hope, and I hope and I anticipate that as these ideas, for example, about ADHD or dyslexia or autism, as these ideas about distinctive cognitive styles and diversity become more well-known, become more popular, become more disseminated in the media, or the idea of depression as a perfectly coherent response to just the normal trials of life, the normal trials of just trying to make a living in a very difficult society. I do hope and expect that as those messages get out, there will be more of an effort to make these broader scale political and social changes to our educational systems, to our legal systems, and so on. But it's a huge question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to say a couple of things that you made me think about, really, and it's just the things we take for granted. So I think you mentioned hearing voices at the start, and people talk often about, for example, internal monologues, and I was just thinking as you were talking, and I just thought of my own internal monologue, and I just thought, okay, it's in my voice. But we kind of make the assumption that everyone has an internal monologue that is their own voice. So I don't think we really have a benchmark to really say, because we've never questioned whether or not everyone has that same internal monologue, and it's the same for everybody, to then go from that point and say, okay, well, this is not normal now, and you are considered normal. And just kind of following on from that, I'm a teacher, and the lovely lady at the back was talking about her experiences. And I think as a teacher as well, we are taught that, not in a overt way, and it's kind of subtle, but you're teaching to the majority of people, but then you make reasonable adjustments for people who aren't considered amongst the norm, or the majority, I would say, not the norm. So I really appreciate, and I want to thank you for your framing, because it certainly helped me really appreciate not referring to people who might have a different way of perceiving things, and even just using that language in front of them of, let's just do it a little bit differently for you, because I think that others them without you realizing it. So I think the other thing is just thank you for providing the language, I think, that I will use going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I do, when it comes to neurodiversity and what we sometimes think of as learning disabilities, I mean, that's very kind of near and dear to my heart. What are the messages that we're giving, particularly kids who are, the way that we frame it is going to follow them through their whole life and development in these crucial formative years. Yeah, hearing voices, it's so fascinating and important from a number of different levels, because I do wonder, okay, to what extent, when we talk about neurodiversity, we typically think about things like ADHD, some forms of autism, dyslexia, where you can see what's happening in terms of a slightly different way of processing information about the world. But when it comes to hearing voices, we usually block that particular interpretation or that particular framing. And I do wonder if we will ever have a society where the experience of hearing voices might be seen, okay, in some contexts it might be seen as a trauma response. In some contexts it might be seen as one part of your mind trying to talk to another part of your mind, and maybe being misinterpreted as hostile somehow. But I do wonder, and I hope that we will have a day where we might think about hearing voices as a form of neurodiversity, as a kind of distinctive cognitive strategy with its own strengths and its own trade-offs. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, very interesting. You mentioned trauma. So if you take the example of somebody who's had a traumatic childhood, and as a result of that has developed dissociation as a strategy for dealing with trauma, and that is something which you can, I believe, pick up on a brain scan. And then because of that dissociation, that person, through no fault of their own and not voluntarily, is then exposed, if they happen to come across other people who want to abuse them, to further trauma because of that response. Would you not say that's dysfunctional? And so just bearing that particular example in mind, I appreciate your framing, but I wonder whether I'm struggling to see the pathway through with this particular framework to help people who perceive themselves as having issues that they need help with and feel that there's something dysfunctional about them. And maybe the part of the issue is this being exposed to something rather than people reaching solutions on equal footing. So you mentioned a diversity of types of people. Maybe psychiatrists and people like that could be put into a type as well. Maybe people who have an obsession with categorizing other people and then doing something about them. For example, we could invent one, tonight and maybe run with it. But I think you get the gist. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's a great question, and part of it is just the words that we use. I mean, often enough when we call something dysfunctional, all we mean by that is that, look, this is really not working. This is extremely maladaptive. This pattern of behavior or pattern of thoughts and feelings is really maladaptive in this particular context, and it's really disrupting your ability to kind of get by and thrive. And I absolutely think a lot of these delusions or the BPD traits or depression can be seriously dysfunctional in that particular sense. They can be disruptive and make it hard to kind of get by and thrive in various ways. So when I talk about madness as dysfunction, I usually mean in this kind of deeper sense of, can we see a source of design, function, or purpose here? Or should we see this in terms of something inside of you not working the way that it's supposed to? So even in a case like trauma leading to survival strategies, which could potentially lead people into a kind of pattern of maladaptive relationships or a pattern of maladaptive behavior, I still think that there may be some real benefit in saying, look, what's going on with you is there's nothing wrong with your brain. This is a brain condition. I mean, there's neurological, there is some neural circuitry rewiring that partly explains why you're thinking the way that you do, but there's nothing particularly wrong with your brain. But this is a strategy that somehow outlived its usefulness and that we should try to change.
Yeah, I was just interested about your ideas about scientifically based treatments, and some of the thoughts I had while you were speaking, when you was particularly, I suppose, around some of the personality disorder treatments, were that they can be, so some of the other offerings are things like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, and which offer kind of a bit like you surmised, maybe an idea that you're just not thinking about this in the right way, or you've made a mistake. I mean, there's that potential for stigma going in that direction with those treatments. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts about that, but also with your interest in the philosophy of mind. So when you're suggesting scientifically based treatments, having a different range of options, again, getting an evidence base is much easier if you have that materialistic biological view, because that's science, right? That is right, and then kind of going out from that is the kind of more falsifiable behavioral cognitive stuff, which is easier, which is why it's claimed to have an evidence base. But when we're dealing with trauma and emotions, then it can be harder to get an evidence base for that. And I don't want to overcomplicate it for you, so maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. I do. I mean, I appreciate the point you make about CBT, and my worry about it is that we're still using, in some cases, a madness-as-dysfunction framing, but we're just taking out of this biological context. We're not saying that you have some kind of a chemical imbalance in your brain, but we're saying that you're trapped in a kind of a broken pattern of thinking. You have a dysfunctional pattern of thinking and behavior. And so it's almost as if we're just transferring this broken machine metaphor from the biological realm to the psychological realm. And that is something that I worry about and I think is potentially problematic. Yes, we're not using a biological framing, but we're still going to depict your problems as something's broken inside of you and just needs to be corrected. And then, sorry, the second thing you were saying is just creating an evidence base. I mean, that's and in some cases it's more difficult to really put together an evidence base for some of these alternative framings. That's a huge issue, particularly for, I've been talking to folks in the last week who talk about some of the experiences that we describe as psychosis in terms of the notion of spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis. So the idea being something like this: look, let's just step back, take a very broad perspective on the nature of reality as such, and let's envision something like this. Maybe there is some greater consciousness or greater mind or greater being, and perhaps what we call psychotic episodes or hearing voices or these experiences of panic are just your mind opening up to this greater reality and being kind of confused and overwhelmed, or perhaps interpreting it as hostile and alien. And these are views that the idea of what we call psychosis as a spiritual emergency, I mean, these are views that they don't just go against the last 40 years of biomedical psychiatry, they go against the last 500 years of secularization. They go against the last 500 years of Western civilization in some ways. And so I'm just realizing that some of the obstacles to exploring these framings, again, it's not just biomedical psychiatry, it's the way our culture as a whole thinks about extreme experiences that needs to be questioned.
Yeah, this is really, I'm glad you now start to talk about consciousness, the nature of consciousness, because this is what I felt your presentation was alluding to in terms of the philosophical nature, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche influencing Freud and Heidegger, and the split, the Cartesian approach, the mind-body, which perhaps relate to this lady's contribution that was quite challenging to you, which I thought was necessary in terms of the pathway, and also taking account of cultural anthropology as related to the young woman over there. But the comment about maladaptive behavior, that a behavior out of place, reminds me of Douglas' cultural anthropology work. Like when we talk about a behavior out of place, it's like the notion of dirt is matter out of place. So a behavior that is maladaptive had to be seen within cultural perspective, whereas for the person experiencing that, an episode, as we like, or crisis, it isn't maladaptive. It is about something in their context and time that propels them to behave in a particular way, even if it's from trauma, that at some point it is necessary for you to express, to abreact your trauma, given you were talking about abreaction earlier. But it's only maladaptive within your social context, but for you in terms of how your body tries to repair itself, time, it's, we have to look at it from, in terms of the concept of time and when can this be expressed. That it's the time aspect, whether it's something that happened to you in your childhood and being an adult in which you start to express, trauma in the childhood. So the concept of time becomes interesting, relative as such. So this is what I felt your presentation hasn't acknowledged the cultural anthropological in terms of indigenous people. I was thinking, okay, you're from America. What about the indigenous people in America? How did they deal with this? What work have you done in this area? In African context, in Asian context, be in South Asia, etc. So for me, there was a certain limitations, and possibly I felt on one level, your multiple perspective actually alludes to different global way, different cultures will be able to relate to your multiplicity, but yet you haven't given recognition to that. So that is my criticism to your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think where the cultural anthropology, I mean, there's a lot of areas where I think cultural anthropology becomes extremely useful in thinking about mental health and mental illness. Somebody whose work I like a lot is Tanya Luhrmann, who looks at voice hearing experiences in different cultures, in the United States, in Ghana, and in India. And she looks at how voice hearing has a completely different character and a completely different content. And I think this goes back a little bit to these questions about how certain cultural ideas, and certainly in the United States and the West, have become so deeply entrenched, it's almost hard to think about voice hearing outside of that. So I think in the United States, there's some evidence that voice hearing experiences tend to feel more hostile, more disruptive. They tend to be much more unpleasant kinds of experiences. Her work suggests that in some communities in Ghana or in India, voice hearing experiences, even when they're attributable to schizophrenia, can be much less unpleasant because there's a cultural framework that might say, okay, these could be the voices of my ancestors speaking to me. And if they're my ancestors, they're probably not out to hurt me. They're probably trying to give me some guidance or to help me make important decisions. So, I mean, I really like Hearing Voices Network and other organizations like that because as I see it, part of what they're trying to do is just to keep that kind of a very broad multiplicity of perspectives in mind to help people work through these experiences. But yeah, thank you.
So I thank you for your presentation and lending such grounded language. It was very reorienting. And this is a bit of a large, more abstract question, so I understand if you can't provide such a granular answer. But so one of the merits of upholding the disorder as dysfunction framing is that it placing the disorder into boxes is that it allows the disorder to find community within those boxes, and and that outgroup. So I wonder, hypothetically, if other frameworks were to be enacted wholly throughout the cultural consciousness, what type of tensions would arise within the outgroup, the disordered, once this binding, connecting box is dismantled?
So is it that sometimes these disorder categories create these supportive communities, these communities that come into place around supporting people with this particular disorder? And then is the question, what happens when we start changing these framings and moving outside of these dysfunction or disease or disorder frameworks, where will there still be the same kind of opportunities for connection and community? That is another huge question. I mean, I do think, and coming back to the neurodiversity ideas, I mean, I do think that you see in neurodiversity communities that there is both a strong sense of identity, there's a sense of solidarity, there's a sense of community, and there's also, as I see it, a real challenging of medical frameworks and saying, look, the way that I process information isn't really a disease or a disorder, it's just an alternate style of cognition that often enough is just against the grain of what's culturally expected of me. And I think in to some extent with like the Hearing Voices network and communities of people, changing the language and talking about voice hearing rather than psychosis or these other medical terms. I would like to think that you have these emerging communities of identity and solidarity and support that are at the same time challenging those disease or dysfunction labels. So I hope we can move away from disease and dysfunction talk, but still keep the benefits of the community and solidarity. Hope so.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed just sitting and listening to it. I was just wondering what kind of considerations maybe you have in mind for making decisions. You've mentioned that sometimes these kind of strategies help at certain times, maybe in times of crisis, but then eventually they don't help anymore in a different context. Just what kind of considerations might feed into when we should see it as this is a strategy which we should leave in place because it's doing important things for that person, versus when we can start putting other things on the table, that there might be better coping mechanisms which don't have quite as many drawbacks as what was helping at a time of crisis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. So I don't know. So as I see it, there are at least three, if not more, categories. One is the kind of pure dysfunction category. Something has gone wrong in your brain or in your mind, and this is just the byproduct. Another is a kind of a pure function category. Your depression, even if it is or it seems maladaptive in some ways, it is actually a meaningful response to a life challenge. It's part of your mind that's trying to get you to see that something is not working out. And then you have this kind of third category of survival strategies that may have outlived their usefulness. And I just think that's such a case-by-case issue. I don't think we can make any generalization. So one thing I worry about, some of the evolutionary theorists talk in the following way. They'll say, consider ADHD. Okay, Justin, that sounds like that might have helped our nomadic ancestors. Maybe it helped us when we were still exploring the globe, and maybe people with ADHD type traits were more likely to explore and to migrate and to find new sources of land and water and such. But today, that's really more of a vestige of this ancestral way of being, and it really is not relevant or helpful to a kid who's just trying to do well in school. And I want to say, let's not dismiss ADHD too quickly as a vestige of an earlier time that has no benefits for us today. Let's try to figure out where this can still be seen as purposeful and useful and strategic. And the same with some of these BPD traits where, okay, maybe mistrust, maybe that was a relic of a earlier part of your life where it was useful and valuable and it's no longer valuable, but sometimes mistrust is a very useful and it has a kind of continuing usefulness. So I do think it has to be a case-by-case basis, and I do worry that it might be too easy for mental health professionals to say, you know, I really like this idea of strategy, but I think that a lot of times their mental health problems come from the fact that they're deploying some kind of strategy that's no longer useful. But I don't know how to distinguish, though.
Well, we're just about at time, I'm afraid. But thank you all very much for your contributions. You were a very animated audience, so that's much appreciated. But thank you, especially Justin, for a great talk.
Thank you so much.